Good morning, everyone. My name is Joshua Omnuk. I'm part of the Agape Art Coalition. And I thank you very much for joining on time. I can see so many participants, some from Nigeria, some from South Africa. Wow, this is a very good turn up, and so many more people are joining. So today we shall be having a training for about 1 hour and 30 minutes, and we shall be having a couple of facilitators. I'll be introducing some of them, but first of all, let me tell you about Agape Art Coalition. Agape Art Coalition is a group combined of NGOs which are led by youth around Africa. For example, Climate Justice for Healthy Communities, Blue Earth Organization, among others. And it's a coalition where more organizations are still joining, because we believe when more voices are put together, we can demand for climate justice in a more effective way. Today, basically, the topic we shall be addressing will be loss and damage. And among our facilitators, there is Solisa Nagwadia. If I don't pronounce your name very well, or when you're speaking, you'll correct me. And this one will be addressing the structure of loss and damage under the UNFCCC. The session will be for 20 minutes, and another session of question and answers. The next speaker is from Climate Action Network, Haja Singh. She'll be addressing funding agreements for loss and damage under the UNFCCC. And another speaker will be Sumaya Zakledin, will be addressing loss and damage policy and technical issues under the UNFCCC. Then after, we shall be having a general discussion where everyone will be able to submit their opinions and what they think. Right now, I encourage each and everyone to share in the chat where you're from, your name, and tell us how you feel. Yeah, thank you very much. Right now, I call on to the moderator to carry on from here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joshua, and it's a real pleasure to be part of this initiative by the Agape Coalition. Um, just some housekeeping, all right? In your invites, you will have received a registration form, and we'll encourage you to actually fill it in, even if you have already joined the meeting without registering. And then the second thing, which I am going to share just now, is that we'll be using two tools. There's a tool called Mentimeter. So on the device that you are using or on your phone, please go to www.mentimeter.com and enter the code that is showing on your screen right now, because there is some interactive aspects of the discussion that we will be hoping that you contribute to. The other thing, I noticed that we've got about 64 registered participants. So it's gonna be useful to use the raise hand functionality, and I trust that Joshua and Tato will assist me in that regard, as I will be on full screen on my side. And as Joshua mentioned, the chat is open. Please feel free to share your views, raise your questions in there, and interact with each other as well. When we get to the Q&A sessions, please feel free to also share your views. It's not just about you seeking clarity from on the discussion, but also just your views. And also for your information, please note that this webinar is recorded. Okay. Now, I trust that you have logged on to Mentimeter, and my first slide will actually be on Mentimeter, and it's a very straightforward contribution that I would like you to make. And we all have different starting points in engaging in the negotiations, and we all have different perspectives with regards to what are they about, are they effective, are they moving fast, etc., etc. Now, on your screen, on www.mentimeter.com, please enter what your response will be on the question that says, how would you describe loss and damage negotiations on climate change? That just in a single word, how do you feel about loss and damage? How do you think the negotiations are going? And please, you can start right now to enter your responses. And see, we already have a few responses, quite political, and it's interesting, sugar-coated and hypocritical, which suggests that there is a sense that the discussions themselves are not addressing the real issues that need to be addressed. It's not broad enough, so the scope of what is being discussed is a bit limited. They are slow, they are dragging, but there is a view that the negotiations themselves are fair, all right? And I look forward to further inputs from your side in terms of how you think. They are exclusionary, they are secretive. Nobody really knows what is happening in these discussions. And they are unrealistic. That's interesting. And I hope in the next 2.5 hours or so, we will be having a good sense of good enough. They are dragging, not practical. unrealistic. Yeah, we've got about 7 inputs so far, and we've got 31 participants. So I'm just gonna give it another minute or two, so that we've got a good perspective of the starting points with regards to the loss and damage negotiations. Not practical and not realistic, unreliable. Yeah, I guess just moving on, I guess the point of this slide is just to show that there are different perspectives with regards to climate change negotiations in general, and there are different perspectives even with regards to how we characterize the loss and damage negotiations. And this is not only unique to this group that is participating in this webinar. Even if you go into the negotiations themselves, the divergence of the perception of how rapid are the negotiations proceeding always depend on the point of view from which you are negotiating. At least what I see here would be some of the observations that most developing countries, especially African countries, would, to some degree, characterize the negotiation. So hopefully, as I said, in the next 2 hours or so, we'll have a better perspective in terms of what is happening in the negotiations. And there is an opportunity for you to also input and share your views amongst each other, as well as with some of the panelists that we have who are actively involved in the negotiations. Now, moving on to the next slide. All right. Now, what are your expectations from this session? I think this specific question is going to be helpful not only to me, but also to the panelists so that they can decide on how to pitch their inputs and interventions in this regard. So the slide has moved on to there, so you've got an opportunity to put in your responses. And if I recall correctly, there's no limit to the number of responses that you can put in. So what are your expectations here? And and the tool is completely anonymous. So even from my side, I can't see who sent what, but what is important is the message and the content. So one can be as honest as they can in the discussion. And the first response is about understanding a bit about loss and damage, as well as how negotiations are carried out. I can already think of one slide that I have, which actually explains the decision-making process in the UNFCCC. How can the coalition make an input on the loss and damage negotiations? Issue of the transitional committee and the pace at which loss and damage finance is being being processed, how to become a negotiator. I think we've got just the correct panelists for this webinar, because Sumaya, Dr. Zakildin, is actually a member of the Transitional Committee representing Africa. So, and I understand they had their fourth meeting quite recently. So you will be hearing the latest that is happening in that discussion. To understand how to access help, knowledge and skills, how can we have young negotiators who are not only participating as observers. Okay, I think just moving on from this slide, I think we are going to have a little bit of everything that people are expecting from this webinar. And some of the questions may not be adequately addressed in light of time available. For example, issues of how to become a negotiator, that is not covered to a large extent in this webinar, but of course, there are views that people like myself, who has been involved in the negotiations for a while, can share some experiences in that regard. Now, how we're going to structure this specific section is that I'm going to do a framing presentation, after which Harjit Singh will take some questions, probing questions from myself, and he gives his responses. And you are free as well to quiz him. We have about 15 or so minutes to raise any questions that you may have. Now, going back to my framing presentation. So in this framing presentation, I'll just cover 4 things. What is loss and damage? The history of loss and damage in the UNFCCC, the governance arrangements, as well as active processes at this stage. Now, I mean, this is a slide from the UNFCCC, which clearly distinguishes that when one is dealing with loss and damage, there are 2 categories that you are dealing with. The first one being extreme events, such as your droughts, your heat waves, your floods, etc. So these are events, these are climate or weather events that happen rapidly. So there's a lot of damage that will be associated with flood, and these damages can be economic in nature, whereas some of them are non-economic. But there are also different types of events, which are slow onset events, such as your sea level rise. It's not a very rapid process, but sea level rise in itself, as much as it's a slow onset event, it does exacerbate the risk of some of extreme events that happen. For example, if you get coastal storm surges, that is rapid, but it's aggravated by sea level rise. You've got your desertification, increasing temperatures, land and forest degradation, loss of biodiversity, glacial retreat, ocean acidification. All these are processes that take a fairly long time in order to materialize. However, they also translate to economic and non-economic losses. And the economic losses that we're looking at could be in terms of income that can be derived from disrupted business operations, reduced agricultural productivity, and reduced tourism opportunities as well. And some of the losses could well be damage to physical assets, such as infrastructure and property. And this being an African collective, I'm sure we've got a number of examples of economic losses that we have experienced in different regions of the continent. Whereas on the other side, you've got your non-economic losses, such as a loss of life is not economic in nature, poor health outcomes, that's not economic, even though it does have a bearing on the ability to generate livelihoods and income. And those are the types of losses that affect individuals, whereas others affect the whole society. And one of the most famous examples will be your small island states that are effectively losing territory and losing cultural heritage and losing knowledge systems of how communities have evolved over time. And some of them, of course, would be environmental in nature. So this is one of the most simple and straightforward ways in which one could just explain what loss and damage encompasses. Now, going to the history of loss and damage in the UNFCCC negotiations, I think the first instance that I could pick up of a discussion on loss and damage is from 1991, from the Alliance of Small Island States, where they proposed a global risk transfer pool for all losses and damage that results from the changing climate system. But it's very interesting to note that it was only in 2007 at COP13 in Bali that there was the first mention of risk transfer and insurance in the climate negotiation process. So if one relates that to some of the characterizations that you put forward, that the process is slow, that's just but one manifestation of such. And I thought I should just go through a timeline. This is something that you can have, with your slides, in that, as I said, in 2007 in Bali, that's when loss and damage was introduced. And then at COP16, I think it was in Cancun or something like that, a work program on loss and damage was established in 2010, sorry. And then in 2013 in Poland, that's when the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage was established. This is one of the processes that are still active and guiding the negotiations under the UNFCCC. And associated with that is a constituted body, which is the executive committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. And again, just to demonstrate that you are in good hand, if I remember correctly, Sumaya was in the first ExCom of the WIM. So you are in good hands. So whatever difficult question you have, we've got people like Sumaya and Harshit to respond to that. And at COP20, that's when the initial work plan was done. And at COP21, this was the first time when loss and damage was inscribed as a separate article in the Paris Agreement, and a task force on displacement was also established in that period. By going through each of those milestones, is that in 2021, at least, some of the processes that are being followed under the UNFCCC, the Santiago network, was started, and the Glasgow Dialogue was established. And it is out of the Glasgow Dialogue that now we've got a transitional committee that has to make some recommendations at COP28 in terms of funding arrangements for loss and damage. All right. Now, just stepping back to more the politics of it, all right. There have been some difficulties and key issues, and I think they still persist even today, all right. In that, in the early days particularly, the key issue of attributing extreme events to a changing climate was something that was not clearly understood. And if you are to hold someone accountable, you need to be able to be quite clear to say, this damage can definitely be attributed to this specific driver. But over time, the attribution science, which is a specific discipline in climate science, is gaining ground. For every major disaster that you get, you are likely to get some publication from institutions that work on attribution science to indicate by how much can that specific event to be linked to a changing climate. All right. So that is still something that is evolving over time in order to increase accountability in respect of loss and damage. The other issue that has been on the table is the concept of liability and compensation. And this is strongly linked to the question of attribution science, because in many legal jurisdictions, if you are to be compensated for a damage that is attributed to a specific driver, you need to be able to attribute, firstly, the damage that has occurred. And a lot of your global north countries, particularly the United States, this is an area that they even managed to strike a deal with a small handful of developing countries to clearly delineate in the Paris Agreement that the inclusion of loss and damage as Article 8 of the Paris Agreement does not imply the issue of liability and compensation. I mean, this is driven by the fear of the trillions of damage that has happened over the years, for which different nation states can be charged with, for lack of a better word. And another issue is definition of loss and damage activities. I think this is going to become quite important as the work of Transitional Committee for Funding Arrangements concludes its work or make its recommendations, because it's not always obvious to define what activity can one do in order to avert, minimize, or address loss and damage. All right. And I'm working also with some other colleagues who are in academics, including negotiators, on coming up with an approach of how to classify and define loss and damage activities, because a definition of activity determines what can be financed. And the last thing that any developing country, especially African countries, can accept is a situation where this has to be decided, like projects are decided on the basis of only what the board members of the funding arrangement say. Because if we look at institutions such as the GCF, for example, we have had some serious difficulties in getting some projects approved, because our partners from developing countries will be of the view that the adaptation, or in this case, loss and damage rationale, is not strong enough. So with predefined activities, then that can help in streamlining that process. But some of the emergent issues in the negotiations will include, where does the money come from? I think developed countries are interested in having a broader pool of countries that contribute for loss and damage. There's a question of recipients. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also the issue of eligible activities. I know that I'm not doing that great on time, so I'm not gonna spend too much time on this slide. Safe to say, the governance structure within the UNFCCC as it pertains to loss and damage is as shown in the figure on your screen. So effectively, you've got governing bodies where you've got the Conference of Parties. This is a Conference of Parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then you also have the CMP or the CoP MOP, whatever way you want to refer it, which is the Conference of Parties serving as a meeting of parties to the Kyoto Protocol, which is an instrument under the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And of late, you've got the Conference of Parties serving as the meeting of parties to the Paris Agreement, which is in short called the CMA. What is important to note here is that the Conference of Parties is the supreme body. It takes precedence over any other body that you have because it is the Conference of Parties to the agreement, to the Framework Convention on Climate Change itself. But you will notice that in the negotiations, I think this is going to play out quite a lot at COP28, in that the interpretation of some developed countries is that the attempt is to basically dissociate the CMA, which is the Conference of Parties for Paris Agreement, from the COP, simply because of the Framework Convention on Climate Change places much clearer and stronger obligations for developed countries to lead in climate action, which through negotiations in Paris, some of those were weakened a bit. So this has significant political implications, but legally, the supreme body, decision-making body is the COP. And then you've got permanent subsidiary bodies in the UNFCCC, which is the SUBSTA as well as the SBI. So the SBI supports implementation, whereas the SUBSTA supports scientific and technological advice to all processes of the convention. And then the next tier, and these meet, the SBs, they meet in June as well as just before the COP. And the outcomes of the COPs are what are referred to as draft conclusions. The subsidiary bodies themselves cannot take binding decisions, but they can draft conclusions that are going to be considered by the governing body, which in this instance would be the COP. So that is the route through which decisions are made. But the Conference of Parties itself can also every now and then establish what are called constituted bodies. In respect of loss and damage, what I mentioned, which is the Executive Committee of the WIM, or the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, that is the main constituted body that guides work that is happening across the various elements of the UNFCCC process on loss and damage. And the second one that may or may not, or the second one that was established, of course, is the Transitional Committee, but it has a limited mandate. By COP28, it has to deliver its recommendations, and then parties will decide as to whether that mandate gets extended, etc., or even whether the Transitional Committee can lead to a separate component of the finance mechanism of the UNFCCC that is specific to loss and damage. But once again, we'll hear more from Sumaya and Harshit about that. Now, on ongoing processes, since this will be available, we've got the WIM, as I mentioned, and we've got the Santiago Network on loss and damage. So the idea behind the Santiago Network is to just provide technical support to countries in respect of their actions on loss and damage, whereas the Fiji Clearinghouse for Risk Transfer is just a repository of information on insurance and risk transfer. And if you go to the UNFCCC website on the Fiji Clearinghouse, you will find some case studies, type of funding that is available for different risk transfer strategies, as well as general literature on loss and damage. And then the other active process is the task force on development, or on displacement, sorry, whose role is to develop recommendations for integrated approaches in respect of abating, minimizing, and addressing displacement that is driven by loss and damage. So this is the broad framing that I have for this specific session. And I trust that Harjit has joined us, because he's gonna join us for a moment and then take questions and excuse himself. Are you there, Harjit? Okay. I will check whether Harjit has joined us, but for now, I am happy to take a few questions or comments from your side, and please just use the raise hand functionality. We've got quite a high number, 53 people, so just to keep it orderly. I can take 3 to 4 questions, so if you raise your hand, I am just going to note the hands that are raised. I see Tamsil. Is there any other hand? Go ahead, Tamsil.
Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, from wherever you join it. My name is Tamsir Salah from the Gambia, but currently living in the Netherlands. So, also a member of Yongo under the Loss and Damage Working Group and the Adaptation Working Group. This session is really motivating this early morning, so and energizing. So, I just have a question like regarding the loss and damage process. So, what is the commitment and operationalization of funding like? Like, because we virtually understood that there is a constituted body on loss and damage, and then like they had a mandate, especially the TC, and then I was actually following their process in Egypt, like TC4, and then they were having some back and forth regarding like the fundings and whatever. So, and then I was also like following which institution probably will be responsible about making sure like the fund is evenly distributed or execution funded. So I'm just trying to ask a question like, how is the operationalization of the funding going to be? Because in an event that, like, for example, the World Bank, which parties have agreed to make sure like, they probably may be responsible about establishing institutions that will be responsible about executing or, disbursement of funding. So I don't know. I have I'm really interested about some of those areas, like how the funding can be, evenly distributed, especially to the developing countries. So the other question is like, the bodies responsible to execute disbursement of funding, like, okay, maybe COP28 will determine like, the loss and damage fund, like how is it going to be operationalized? So we understood that where is the funding coming from? We actually know that it's the developed countries that are committed towards making sure loss and damage fund is provided. Pledges are already been done. So like but then how and who is going to be responsible to make sure like those bodies who are responsible about loss and damage fund are all accountable to make sure the fund is being disbursed at a given period or like operationalized, especially to the developing countries. So thank you.
Okay, no, thanks for that comment, Tamsil. I see Excel as well as his hand up.
Yeah. Good morning, sir. Should I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the first question is, I'd like to know what are the implications of having the loss and damage to be hosted by the World Bank? Because I think just a few days ago, the conversation between the developed and developing nations on loss and damage ended in a clash, and this is less than a month to COP28. So it's still being fractured, the discussion. Then secondly, I would like to know what are the implications of having I think that's just basically the question. Having been hosted by the World Bank, like, are there any positive or negative implications for developing nations? Thank you.
Okay. So I take that most of the questions that have come up with regards to the work of the Transitional Committee. And it's my mistake that I thought Harjit will present first, but Sumaya will. And as a member of the TC, I've got my own views with regards to any fund that is hosted by the World Bank in respect of climate action. But I would like to first give Sumaya the opportunity to just share with us some of her views, and if you are ready to address some of to address these questions, Sumaya, please feel free to. But my first question to you, this one on the Transitional Committee was going to be a second question for you. But if you can just share with us your perspective in terms of the key policy and technical issues that need to be resolved on loss and damage during COP28. There's a lot of work happening. There's different streams of work being undertaken on loss and damage, and your views in that respect will be appreciated. And maybe as you conclude that, you can also touch on some of the transitional committee questions that have been raised. You have the floor, Sumaya.
Good morning to all of you, and allow me first to thank the Agape Earth Coalition for this opportunity, and thank you, Lisa, for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. I will come to the question that were raised related to the operationalization of the fund and the significant the implication of hosting the fund at the World Bank. But I would like to start by addressing few issues that would help us to understand some of the difficulties that are currently going on in the discussion of the transitional community. Like you have rightly mentioned that the issue of loss and damage started in Bali. However, at that stage, it was only accepted on the condition that it is not going to be a separate scene. It was accepted as part of adaptation. And at that stage, we were not happy as negotiator. And however, after Paris, I think we regretted that we disconnected it from the adaptation, simply because of the impact of the policy on a separate article on loss and damage. Also, you refer to the process after Bali was quite interesting. It added a lot to the understanding and enhancement of understanding on issues related to loss and damage, simply because a work program was established by Cancun decision at COP 16, and that work program. So for developed countries, they didn't want to have loss and damage at all at the level of the UNFCCC. And I think for a very obvious reason, because loss and damage started with very strong financial statement associated with compensation, and that stand as an alarm for them and for their economy, and they did their best to stop us from moving with loss and damage. So when everything is about political momentum at COP time. So when they accepted loss and damage, they want to suppress it by putting it under adaptation. And when in Cancun came after a very difficult COP in Copenhagen. So when they accepted loss and damage, they there were three main areas: assess what is loss and damage, how would we assess it. That was one theme. It took some time and workshop across the different regions, the different geographical regions in the world, to see how people are doing on issues. And the second theme, which is what type of approaches are you talking about? Because you want to address loss and damage, but how would you address it? And then what is the role of the convention? That was, I think, that was their mistake. That is it. They allow us to put that theme there. And I guess what happened after that was also quite interesting, because the COP in Doha was outstanding COP, and the decision of Warsaw should have been really governed in Doha, but for many issues, because developed countries didn't accept the language of Doha, which was very powerful, very strong. It talks about the role of the convention, the function of the role was segregated into three different categories. These three items, they eventually become the function of the Warsaw International Mechanism. The decision from Doha also that highlighted the issues related to the convention should really enhance the knowledge and understanding on issues related to comprehensive risk management, and should strengthen the dialogue, because there was agreement related to other people outside and inside the convention doing issues relevant to loss and damage. And the third role was the key one, which was about to enhance action and support, including finance, technology, and capacity building. And that was the first time the word finance entered into the UNFCCC in relation to loss and damage. And then the thematic areas identified based on the work that was done under the work program were related to issues related to risk of slow-onset event, non-economic losses, migration. I mentioned this specifically because currently at the level of the transitional committee, these areas were also highlighted as very important areas that the fund need to take care of, among other things. Warsaw International Mechanism was created, and developed countries, their submission was they wanted a fund that at the stage of Warsaw, and they wanted a technical arm to assist countries in their struggle of assessing and identifying approaches to address, minimize, avert, and address loss and damage, as well as they also wanted the issue of action and support to be clearly spelled out. So the function, the Warsaw International Mechanism established at the level of CoP19 under the guidance and accountable to the Conference of Parties. I'm stressing this because this moving along to Paris become quite problematic, and the developed countries were regretting allowing us to put such a language because convention is full of obligation and commitment, and when you're connected with loss and damage, that is a serious issue. In Warsaw, they established an interim arrangement, and that was the first transitional committee. Correction, I wasn't part of that, Kulisa. I was part of the first committee on adaptation, but I think I went after the transitional arrangement, the transitional committee. Then I joined Warsaw International Mechanism as an ex-CoP member representing Africa for 2 sessions. So the language here is quite important because what happened in Paris, like Colisa have just rightly said, some political influence changed work with some developed countries in order to take the decision and to free the developed countries from their commitment and to underline that the work under loss and damage will go only shall be cooperative and facilitative. So it was based on Paris Agreement. That is the case, and that is why up to this moment, even in the last meeting of the TC Transitional Committee, the parties were fighting with each other, developing. We were still, will continue to fight for the loss and damage to be addressed under the convention, its article, commitment, and principles. However, for developed countries, they feel that they should really hook to Paris Agreement. So there was also dangerous decision taken in Paris. In fact, before anyone asked me why we didn't really fought back, in Paris there was no negotiation on loss and damage. There was a decision taken behind the back of everyone, and finally it was a package. Take it or leave it, and the party decided to take it because on other agendas they thought they are doing very well, and so this is what happened. They agreed, parties agreed that the inclusion of loss and damage article. So at the stage of Paris, parties separated adaptation from loss and damage. So Article 7 is adaptation and Article 8 is loss and damage. So that was quite dangerous because based on this decision, loss and damage was disconnected from finance and was disconnected from the global stock take and transparency and the other key agendas, key articles, and the effort in the way to 2020 after Paris in loss and damage negotiation, we were able to accommodate loss and damage in GST and in transparency, but that was really minor thing that during negotiation we were just able to agree on provision of information. However, there was no commitment because they were saying there was no commitment for loss and damage under Article 9, which is finance, and in the GST article, and there was no guidance that there will be information from Article 7. So, and thereafter, after Paris Agreement, the struggle started with the developed countries on the issue of the governance of the of CoP over the women, because there was also in Article 8 there was a statement that in that the Warsaw International Mechanism will be under the authority of the CMA, Conference of Parties, civil meeting of party to Paris Agreement. So for us, developing countries, we had always fought and built the case that Warsaw International Mechanism is still established by the CoP and will continue to work under the guidance of the CoP. So this continue even in the transitional committee discussion now, because parties, they didn't really want, in spite of the fact that the CoP gave CoP and CMA together, they gave the transitional committee the mandate to operationalize the fund and funding arrangement. Together they established the fund and funding arrangement. During the TC meeting, they did their best to exclude the notion of CoP receiving even the recommendation. However, they have no ground to do that, and I think we are succeeding in maintaining the reference and the up to this moment we are hoping to our ground of convention article principles and obligation, and so hopefully that will stand, because you never know what will happen with the politician in the COP time. However, we still have one fight to have at TC5, because we agreed to have a fifth meeting in Abu Dhabi at the beginning of next month. So the issue of the governance is an issue because of the very good decision that we took in Doha and in Warsaw. So always they will be fight against any mention of 3 CB18 and 2 CB19, the decision that created the mechanism. So we created a mechanism with only executive committee. We wanted a technical arm and we wanted the fund. This is what I wanted to say earlier. And we end up only with an executive committee. However, I think with the decision from Sharm el-Sheikh to establish a fund, and with the decision from Madrid, from the Chilean COP, we managed to establish Warsaw Santiago network. So I guess by the operationalization of these two bodies, we will have a full mechanism, because this will make it a mechanism, because we always felt like it's an executive committee that is planted in the middle of nowhere. So in the work of the executive committee, as a member, I have to admit a lot of knowledge has been developed under the EXCOM, particularly in the just last 2 or 3 years. This year we are celebrating, the EXCOM is celebrating the 10th year anniversary, and that's a very long time. However, I guess it took very long time to have a 5-year rolling work plan in place, and that have 5 work streams. These are slow onset event, non-economic losses, comprehensive risk management, human mobility, and action and support. I forget to mention Paris Agreement established the task force on displacement. So the task force on displacement was key, and one of the instruments. We see it as Africa very important because of the issue of human mobility and displacement, and the work need to be done under plan relocation. So what happened, the EXCOM, the discussion was quite difficult when it comes to the action and support work stream, including finance, technology, and capacity building. So this one wasn't going anywhere. No, they were expert group for the other 4 work stream, but not an expert group for action and support for a very long time, only recently. And when this expert group was established, it wasn't possible to establish, to develop a work plan for it. So this still have something to do with the sensitivity of issue of finance. Everything is loss and damage is finance. If you allow any move on that, you might end up with compensation or whatever. So Santiago, like I mentioned, is a milestone for the next COP, and like Kulisa mentioned, it will provide technical assistance to relevant organization, bodies, network, and experts for the implementation of relevant approaches at the local, national, and regional level in developing countries. So when this was established, developers, even for technical assistance, at the beginning they didn't agree to have a body. They wanted it as a uh, website uh, because they didn't really want to see um, this mechanism growing. Because they know if we work on the technical issues, identify the serious areas of loss and damage, then that would lead finally to finance. And that's what they don't really want to see. Um, 27 decided on the new funding arrangement. Already people are ahead of us asking about the implementation and the operationalization. So the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh established the funding arrangement and established a fund and established the transitional committee. Please refer to uh, the decision from Sharm el-Sheikh from both COP and CMA, because this will give you full information about the decision. However, the mandate of the transitional committee is to operationalize the fund and funding arrangement. And I have to say the work of the transitional committee wasn't an easy task. So I don't think anyone would like to be in our place. But I think the group of G77 and China, the big developing countries group, was able to work very well on the different issues required to operationalize the fund. What is remain is to have an agreement as TC on these issues, including the objective and purpose, because we are working on different elements listed in the paragraph 5 of the decision related to the funding arrangement, the term of reference for the fund, and all the rest of it. But however, how to operationalize this is one of the questions. You need to have a term of reference for the governing body, governing instrument for the fund. You need to tell them exactly what is the objective and the purpose, including how this fund will serve the developing countries, and the mandate of that. The objective is just taken from the mandate of Sharm el-Sheikh decision. They even in that there is an area which is difficult because the decision talked about assist developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse impact of climate change in responding to economic and non-economic loss and damage associated with the adverse effect of climate change, including extreme weather event and slow onset event. All the areas Lisa has just explained to you related to economic, non-economic, extreme, and the slow onset event. So the issue of the work of this body should be done in a coherent and complementary manner, because they are already institutions, initiatives, and other bodies outside doing some work. So the fund should be the new coordination and cooperation mechanism. You need to be clear about the scope of the work, because you need to, this is one of the issues important for operationalizing the fund. You need to be quite clear about what is the scope of the work, and based on the submission from developing countries, the scope of the work shall be based on the mandate established by Sharm el-Sheikh. and comply with existing principles and provision under the Convention and Paris Agreement. And the scope was spelling very well the issues related to economic and non-economic losses, issues related to income, physical asset, individual and society and environment. All the conceptualization was around this in developing countries, and that the fund should really work hard to assist countries on recovery, reconstruction, restoration, rehabilitation, including address system-wide and long-term needs. And the issue of we are talking about now and exposed and ongoing actions, we are talking about human mobility and the dignified mobility. We talked, you need to be clear about the scale of finance provided for loss and damage. So in our submission, we are talking about 100 billion a year, and you need to have a legal status for the mechanism, because if you do that, then if you place it under anywhere, you will be fine. You need to design a fund that is operating entity of the financial mechanism, and that would get the directive on the guidance from the Conference of Parties and the CMA. So it will be actually, we were asking about who will do that. The parties will do that, will give clear guidance to the board of the fund in order to implement certain things. We are in the work of the TC, the recommendation will give some guidance to the board. However, the follow-up in the years to come will be coming from the parties, because they will be given guidance to the fund, and then the board will respond back. And these, I'm not going to go through everything. However, these are the certain issues. You need to be clear about the board, its composition, its function, co-chairing, and its additional rules and procedure, all the rest, all of these issues, the engagement of the observer, the stakeholder input, the expert and technical advice. How are you going to establish the secretariat? We are insisting on independent secretariat dedicated to the fund, because if you host your fund in the World Bank, then the World Bank, if you receive secretariat service from the World Bank, then the influence will be on the fund will be by the World Bank policies and business model. You need to decide on the trustee and the eligibility. The eligibility is a quite issue of concern, and I guess all developing countries are particularly vulnerable, as experience with Pakistan and Libya recently put any developing countries in the shoes of those two countries. So the issue of location took very long time from the fourth meeting of the fund, and however, the preference of developing countries is to have a standalone, independent international organization that the parties will give guidance to. It will have international legal personality, because that is also important in leading the financial work and entering into contracts and that. The fund board to operationalize the fund in an expedite manner. This is how we see it, and we hope that it will establish the new independent dedicated secretariat and hire the executive director. This is how now the operationalization would happen. And then based on the submission from developing countries, the host will be an open process, and should be the host selection will be endorsed by the CoP CMA. I guess stop here. Do you want me to go on the issues related to the question? Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe at this stage, we can, I just want to make some comments from my side as well.
Okay.
And then we take another round of questions. But I just want to clarify something which is quite important. Right? I think I made mention of this issue around the CoP and the CMA. Right? And this is leading to like very complicated legal interpretations in terms of what takes precedence in terms of guidance that you get from the Framework Convention as well as from the Paris Agreement. We will note that I know most of the questions were around the funding arrangements and the work of the Transitional Committee. And all the political difficulties that Sumaya is mentioning actually relate to that specific point, in terms of the different interpretations, because whether you are talking eligibility, if you go to the convention, it's much more broader in terms of developing countries that need to receive. You go to the Paris Agreement, there are slight nuances that are put in there where the obligation of developed countries always have that little caveat that says especially these categories of developing countries. So the question of eligibility that is behaved in the TC comes from the difference in perspectives. It's a political issue that may have been solved in Paris using words, but in reality, the politics of it the United States was quite clear as an example. No American money will finance China's action, right? So that's the big driving force, and it's for that reason that there are these caveats in the Paris Agreement. It's the same as when you are talking about the sources of the finance. Right? There's different interpretations because I read, as an example, Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement is saying that developed countries in discharging their responsibility of providing funds to developing countries is in continuation to their obligations under the convention. Clearly written like that. But if you engage a European or American negotiator, they will give you a different interpretation. So a lot of the issues that we are dealing with, they are legal hooks for political positions that have been taken. So in terms of your second comment, or I take it more as the comment itself, in terms of the attempt by developed countries to spread the responsibility to developing countries using current emissions. That is a typical narrative that you will receive from a developed country negotiator. And I think in terms of your other question, Excel, which was about the World Bank, I think Sumaya has covered the decision-making processes of the World Bank. They are biased. And secondly, the instruments the World Bank be comfortable with are not always to the interest of developing countries. For example, I can see the World Bank prioritizing instruments such as insurance as well as loans, all right? And in that instance, that presents a risk of developing countries being further indebted and losing not only their mitigative capacity, but their adaptive capacity to respond to these issues. And I guess the first question that we received on sources, eligibility, etc., those are part of the legal conundrum that we are looking at. So I'm happy to open the floor again to get some. It doesn't have to be questions. It can be inputs in terms
Can I
of.
just pick up on some of these issues as well, or you want me to do it later?
No, let's let's just take maybe two hands for now, and then as you respond to the additional, as you share the additional points that you want to make, you can also touch on the new questions. So Emmanuel, see you've got your hand up. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. My name is Emmanuel Mwanyongo. I'm from Malawi. I've been following the conversation with keen interest, and loss and damage is one of the areas that I really think as Africa we should be pushing, because it's clear we are the ones at the receiving end, and we are the ones that are really affected by the adverse impacts of climate change. So I wanted to ask a question to you, because I've been following COP conversations from 2015, but especially the previous three COPs. One thing I've noticed is that when we are going for COP, we, as Africa as a group, we always know the gaps that are there. We always know what we need to do. For instance, we know by now that these countries that are supposed to be financing loss and damage are not obligated by any legal framework to do so. It is out of goodwill that they do so. Even Article 8 of the Paris Agreement doesn't really, there's no enforcement. It just says it encourages these countries to finance. So I find this to be a very political statement. You can't say you're encouraging somebody, and we know that these countries are not willing to give us these funds. So we are always, after every COP, we're always saying there is no financial mechanism. Even when we do the Warsaw COP, when we did that mechanism, it's not legally enforcing, and there's no financial aspect of it. So my question is, why do we keep on going for COP? We know that these gaps that need to be addressed. We go there, we come back, those gaps still existing, and we carry on. I can guarantee you, we'll go for COP28. We'll come back to address this issue of having a proper financial mechanism, and we'll be waiting for the COP29 in Eastern Europe next year, going with the same problems that we have. So what is stopping Africa from uniting and demanding? Because we need to demand this. We need to demand that there's a proper mechanism. The countries that are the culprits must know that they're not just being encouraged to fund loss and damage, but they're being demanded to do so, and there must be that big economic. So how do we handle this as Africa, so that we shouldn't be going to each and every year for COP where we know this hanging issue? We go, we come back, we go, we come back, and we continue with the advocacy, but we're not really hitting the nail on the head. So how do we handle this? Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Is there any other question, comment before I give the floor back to Sumaya? Okay, Dr. Coalitin.
Thank you so much. I guess
I've never called you that, by the way.
never. This is the first time, right?
Okay. I am just checking, is it just me who found Sumaya to be freezing, or is that shared?
Shared.
Okay.
So goes to the that goes to the ministers. So there is a role of the political leaders and the politicians, and people always have the fear of leaving. But when you go to the technical discussion, these people, they come with mandate. They tell you that I don't have the mandate to agree on this. For example, I spend a whole day fighting on financial inputs and sources of funds. For them, the language they introduce is something like parties to the Convention and Paris Agreement, not excluding anyone. Everyone should contribute. This is their language. While for us, we base on our submission on the obligation of the convention. We were talking about developed countries and talking about the funding of loss and damage should be grant. It's not development work. So you don't really expect to see loans or concessional loans or that. So the discussion is difficult, but this is the track of negotiation. It has always been like that. Without the multilateralism, it wouldn't have been possible to have a fund established in Sharm el-Sheikh. So people normally, you don't feel like happy about a decision. However, over time, you hope things would improve. And as long as you are playing, you keep playing very well. So the ball is on our side now, and we are working really hard at the level of the TC. And the G77 and China is showing solidarity, and the chair from Cuba, Ambassador Pedro and Ambassador Frank, both of them were with us all the time, attending, and we were coordinating on issues of legibility, issues of prioritization of countries was not breaking the unity of G77. We are facing a lot of challenge, but we are doing our best to sort the decision before. Hopefully, we'll be able to do that. However, I still see difficulty on sorting the issue of developed countries obligation to loss and damage, because for them they tell you that this is a political issue. We don't have mandate to work on that. Scale of finance, we don't have mandate to work on that. They want to see the World Bank hosting the fund. So I mean, if you didn't really work hard on your side, the decision will be something really disastrous. Before Sharm el-Sheikh, there was no financial mechanism or funding or any finance for anything other than meeting or workshops for the EXCOM. Accordingly, I think you just need to all of us to work hard, and the observers are doing their best, and they are really being in our side and doing the stress required at different levels. I hope Harjit is here and he is going to brief us on how they are acting on this. However, they have been with us all the time, day and night. Last day we worked until 2:30 in the morning. So I guess Police, I also handled some of the issues that you were talking about related to the sources of finance and the issues of the loan or the World Bank, and also the World Bank has very high fees for hosting secretariat, and they don't agree on the legal personality of the fund, and they said it clearly: if the fund has a legal personality, they will not host it. And for the developed countries, they see Article 9.1 doesn't really talk about loss and damage. In spite of that clear link with this convention, they don't see the convention talking about loss and damage. However, I mean, what happened when you talk about loss and damage, you talk about the failure in mitigation and in adaptation. I think this is about climate justice as well, and people really need to disregard what they are saying and work hard on fighting the developing countries issues. I thank you. This is the last one, right?
Yeah, okay. No, thanks, Sumaya. I also want to just start with the point that Emmanuel had raised. You know, why are we not just demanding what is due to us? Unfortunately, international law generally is soft law. As such, is unenforceable. It's voluntary. By signing into international law, you are effectively giving away portions of your sovereignty in as far as you believe it helps your country to pursue its national interest. So in that sense, it doesn't matter how strong a language that you can have in a multilateral environmental agreement. Truth of the matter is, it cannot be legally enforced. Any party can also withdraw from any agreement as they wish. So at times, this is why you find that in a lot of your international agreements, there's a lot of constructive ambiguity that gets built into these agreements in order to provide space for the different states to get a perspective that their views were taken on board. I mean, a typical example is this issue of that I mentioned, Article 9.1. I interpret it the way that I am interpreting it, but in terms of this is a continuation of an obligation developed countries have in the Framework Convention, but they interpret it differently, and there's no recourse. So constructive ambiguity is quite common in order to advance action. And I must say that I think most of us characterize the negotiations as being slow, um, secretive, and stuff like that. States make their own decisions. I was with Sumaya when the deal for loss and damage in the Paris Agreement was communicated to us by the then chair of AOCs. And it was catastrophic for us because our position had been very clear. But in reality, geopolitics will always come into play. Countries with significant power have got an opportunity to arm wrestle or come of weaker countries. So the only option that as African countries we have, not just African countries, but developing countries as a whole, is a stronger multilateral process. Over time, it does deliver. I mean, if one looks at the negotiations in the past 20 years or so, we never had any institutions, all right, like the CCN for technology, the capacity building institutions, etc., the GCF, amongst others. The GCF is not perfect, okay? It's also subject to some of these issues that are being negotiated. But if you compare to what was by 2010 or 2012, you would also agree that we are in a better place than we were then. So there's a lot of nuance that has to be built in the negotiation process.
Can I just compliment one thing, if possible? Just last comment.
Yes, please go ahead.
Sorry, because because the sound was breaking, I didn't really hear clearly your point, Emmanuel. Because the issue of detection and attribution will not allow us currently to do this, but because now we are at the forum of the youth, then I guess in your time in the future you might be able to work on this, because maybe at the level of AR20 or something of the IBCC, when countries are able to do the detection and attribution and connect loss damage with whatever GHG, hopefully at that stage the climate climate change process would resolve the the challenge of mitigation. The future it might be possible to do this, but even for them they were challenging us and there is this process. The issue of liability is not allowed. You can't do that outside because they know that outside is not possible now. Because Vanuatu tried, their president was in the middle of the water when he was talking about that case. So you don't even need evidence more than that to prove that the sea level rise is destroying the economy of the country. However, yet it is just impossible to relate it with emission from which country and what state and that. So I would just stop here. Thank you, Alexa.
Thanks, Maya. I see that there are questions around loss and damage and the GST, as well as whether this legal interpretation between the CoP and the CMA can be resolved. I think the second one, I don't see it getting resolved. You know, they say diplomacy is the art of the possible. Okay? It's not about, it's not binary, it's not 0-1 or black and white, but but the political pressure, not just from developing country negotiators, but from civil society, from business, from across the society. It's how different governments get pressed in order to deliver more. So I don't think pursuit of a legal clarification without a political understanding would even be possible, especially that we moved from a regime that in our view was much more clearer. This one opens up some loopholes. So the likelihood of going back to a regime that is stricter would require significant heavy lifting. And then on the issue of loss and damage, you want to share, I know I do some stuff on loss and damage, but to get views from your side, Sumaya. Okay.
I guess on the, do you want me to just to comment on the issue of the GST?
Yes, please.
Yeah, because the GST, I think the current GST didn't really reflect on loss and damage very well, and it was still combined with. I mean, these people they connect loss and damage with adaptation when they want, and they disconnect it with adaptation when they want as well. Because currently under the GST it is connected, and then we talked, Kulisa, about framing and assessing and quantifying needs as related to adaptation and loss and damage at the stage of framing the GST during Paris Agreement. So the information, there wasn't enough information, I guess, to my understanding. Very little effort was made to collect information to quantify the loss and damage in order to give the GST sense about the status of loss and damage and how because obviously there was no even commitment. So developed countries, they didn't want to hear anything about quantification or assessment or signal from regions and from countries, because we had a fight at that in the EXCOM. We wanted to call for submission from countries and from regional groups, and the only thing that was done by the EXCOM is to prepare a submission around loss and damage in the UNFCCC before establishment and after establishment of Wars International Mechanism, the bodies that are working on that. So issues related to provision of financial and technical resources for developing countries, even for preparation of their plans and for implementation of short, medium, and long-term plans related to identification of implementation approaches, and of approaches to address loss and damage. I think the discussion should really be centered around the how the challenge, the amount of challenge faced by countries in relation to adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. And then we do have enhanced the mechanism itself. How does it really live up to the challenge, and to what extent the what we have in our hand is quite enough, or we want to build on what is existing in order to provide resources, technical or financial, for countries. I guess the decision from COP28, if we manage to agree on operationalizing Santiago and the fund, then that would be quite important, because that would also would enable us to make some recommendation regarding the assessment and evaluation of the undertaking of these bodies in the subsequent GSTs. So we think also they should really, as Africa, they should really work on taking stock from the region and globally, as well as how loss and damage should be the assessment of that. The first point that I started with, because we can't go blind to the GST, because the effectiveness and adequacy of the institution, of the resources, is quite important, because we are facing a very dangerous situation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maya, and I wish to thank you for taking time to share your views. And colleagues, Sumaya is an assistant professor at the Institute for Environmental Studies in Khartoum, at Khartoum University in Sudan. And he's the coordinator of climate change research and training at the Institute. And she's an IPCC-led lead author in the 5th and 6th assessment report, as well as the special report on land, and currently is coordinating NAPRED. And as you would have picked up, a long-standing history in the UNFCCC processes, and served on a number of bodies, and is the lead for the African group on loss and damage, and has led adaptation as well, and is currently a member of the transitional committee. So if you happen to, luckily there was video, if you get to see her at COP28, I'm sure you can always get some insights in between being stuck in small rooms and dealing with recalcitrant negotiating partners. So once again, thanks, Maya, for your input.
Thank you, Kolisa, and thank you for listening. I hope that was useful. Thank
Definitely.
you for. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah. Okay. Cheers. Bye.
So, Harjit is here. I will listen to Harjit as well.
Yes,
Hi.
Harjit is here. No, everybody wants to hear
Sumaya.
what Harjit.
Hello, Harjit.
Hi, Sumaya.
Yeah. We all want to hear what you have to say, Harjit. And just as manner of introduction, Harjit is a global expert on issues of climate impacts, migration, and adaptation, and has been supporting a number of countries across the world on tackling climate change. And he led Action Aid international climate change work globally, and is a member of the UN Technical Expert Group on Comprehensive Risk Management under the WIM. And he has served as the board member of CAN. I think that's CAN India, right? CAN I, and the global network. CAN International. Okay, CAN International. And also the global network of civil society organizations for disaster reduction. And somehow he finds time to do other things as a co-founder of the Satat Sampada, which is a social enterprise that promotes sustainable and environmental solutions such as organic food and farming in India and beyond. So thank you for making time, Harjit. And we have had quite a bit of engagement so far, and a lot of things have gravitated towards the funding arrangements for loss and damage, which is quite natural because it's one of the big outcomes that we'll be looking at COP28. So maybe you can just start off sharing your views on funding arrangements, and afterwards there will be an opportunity for me to come with the second round, and the participants in the webinar can also do the same. So you have the floor, Harshit.
Thank you so much, Kosa, for inviting me, and my pleasure to join, and particularly Sumaya here. And I'm sure many of our friends who are in the negotiations are also going to be joining other sessions and sharing their experiences. And it's hard to come after Sumaya. I don't know how much she must have already shared, and she's right inside and drafting policies and influencing the system. So probably there's going to be some repetition in what I'm going to cover. So excuse me for that, and apologies for not being able to join earlier. I've had back-to-back calls, and thank you for your flexibility for me to join now. Normally, I don't like doing it that way. I want to stay for the whole session so that I hear, learn, and contribute, and not just come and do my session. So but it's just quite a hectic schedule. And so, yeah, thank you very much for your understanding. I'm sure Sumaya must have shared the politics and what's going on, and I could hear a few words when she was sharing what kind of push we were making, and the other side, developed countries, were not responding to what is needed. So just briefly going back again, Sumaya must have shared, going back to COP27 decision that we got. What we were pushing for, as developing countries, as civil society, was a loss and damage fund. Of course, at COP26, the language was facility, because we thought the word facility would fly better than fund. But thanks to leadership of developing countries and push from civil society, we even got the language of fund at COP27, which is amazing. And that shows also the power of advocacy if we do it sharply, together, in a united manner. And the other language that we got was funding arrangement. Now, I'll be honest, we were not very happy with that language, and not because technically it makes sense, it doesn't make sense, it does. But politically, we knew why that language is being put, how they are going to misuse that language, and I'm talking of rich countries, and how we'll be fighting really hard to distinguish between fund and funding arrangements and the relationship between the two, and how we are going to make sure that fund has an edge over funding arrangements. Honestly, some of my colleagues were, when we were celebrating the breakthrough that we got at COP27, some colleagues were not uh, that much in a celebratory mode. There was like this caution, and some of us were aware of that. But we said, at this moment, we need to send out a very clear, also political message, that this is a victory of all the vulnerable people who have been fighting, and governments who have been pushing this issue at this level, to also tell the world that this is going to be a turning point. And that's how we wanted it to be kind of setting the narrative, so that we also fight hard later. And it is a turning point in so many ways, because when you look at the conversation that started with the very first um, transitional committee meeting, and Sumaya, you know what I'm going to say. I I was pleasantly surprised that at least rich countries were not blocking the discussion on loss and damage, or even backtracking. And even we heard countries like the US and EU saying that they want to see a decision on fund and funding arrangement. And the reason I was pleasantly surprised, not because they were doing something, it was something remarkable. It's because we, after seeing the blockage that, the blocking that happened for 10 years, uh, to not even discuss loss and damage finance under Warsaw International Mechanisms Executive Committee that Sumaya was referring to, we were like, and the kind of mistrust that we have. We have seen rich countries backtracking. So first meeting, they were at least holding that line that they want to see a decision. We knew they are going to make it difficult, and that's exactly what we saw last week. And yes, where Sumaya and I were there, and we could see how talks actually collapsed, and which is so unfortunate. As we get closer to the COP, we wanted to see a decision coming in. Sorry for this background, but I just wanted to situate that how the conversation started on funding arrangements. Now, when we talk about funding arrangements, we look at how the funding streams outside UNFCCC are also playing a particular role in supporting communities to recover from climate impacts. And humanitarian is one part of it. But then the politics was happening the way rich countries created the whole global shield, which we heavily criticized, because one, it was distracting us from setting up a fund. And then we knew it was purely insurance initially. And because we were hitting it hard and criticizing, they added some more element and said, no, we are working with vulnerable countries. There is a group called, CBF and C20 and V20. So we are working with the vulnerable countries. And so you need to support it. So they were trying to make it politically palatable. But the reality is, and I was asking this question, how much money has actually been channeled through that stream, which you claim as part of funding arrangements? They have no answers actually, because they have not supported communities. It still is insurance heavy, even if they are saying they're going to set up a fund and there's going to channel money. We know it's, the list of countries is limited. It doesn't support all developing countries. And then the kind of support that's going to go to these countries is also going to be very limited. Now, this is a challenge when we talk about funding arrangements. So there are several funding arrangements. You talk about GFDRR, Global Facility on Disaster Risk Reduction, which is often talked about. Then there is many disaster response funds at global and local levels. So what rich countries are trying to do, and in fact, you have invited me to talk about funding arrangements. In the next few weeks, we are going to be releasing a report actually doing an assessment on funding arrangements, and I'm going to talk about the criteria which we have already submitted. So what we felt, because rich countries were talking so much about the funding arrangements, we as civil society thought it is so important to actually set up a criteria which can assess whether the funding arrangements that they are talking about are actually real or not. So that's exactly what we did. So when we were in Dominican Republic, where the third transitional committee was happening, we actually went with a list of criteria, because the challenge that we are facing is we don't even have a definition of climate finance, and anything and everything is being counted as climate finance. We have seen 70% of climate finance that is being provided is loan. That is unfair and unjust to vulnerable communities and countries who would like to see this coming as public finance and not private finance and not money as loans, which means that it is already going to exacerbate the debt crisis that vulnerable countries are facing. So it is absolutely unacceptable, and we know that same game and is going to be played for funding related to loss and damage, and they're going to count everything and say so much of money is happening. So it's not just double counting, but triple counting that's going to happen. And we don't want relabeling of that funding. So thinking of all that, we came up with a criteria. So if my sharing is enabled, if you can enable my sharing, I'm going to share what we as CAN, working with our allies, actually came up with the criteria to assess some of these funding streams that are being claimed as part of funding arrangements. If we allow that to happen without putting any criteria, we will see no new money coming in. So we have a set of demands, and if my sharing is now enabled, I'm going to share my screen and tell me if you can actually see. Okay, before I go to the criteria, in fact, I should share this, which you may find useful. So when we talk about funding arrangements, let's look at how we are interpreting it. So for G77 in China, the funding arrangement is about the purpose is to mobilize resources, promote a more coordinated approach. So that means between fund and funding arrangements, and convene key stakeholders and serve as a platform for discussion, which is absolutely needed. So we are going to set up a fund. Then there are existing streams. How do we make sure that coordination happens? So that's absolutely fair that we will need a platform whatever shape it takes, but we need to coordinate because we don't want to also undermine humanitarian finance. And humanitarian aid has played an important role to help communities recover from these impacts, but we know it's not good enough. I can give you a data. Oxfam came up with a report recently which said just a little over 50% of humanitarian appeals are being funded. And humanitarian appeal amount that is put forward is not a real reflection of all the needs. It's only related to immediate response and some part of rehabilitation and reconstruction and not entirely. And that's why we are saying that we need a fund that plays a more coordination role, and then funding streams that are outside, which are seen as funding arrangements, play an important but complementary role. Now, from European Union's perspective, they want to explore ways for better coordination, but for them, it is about multilateral development banks and International Monetary Fund. We need to understand the business model of these multilateral development banks and International Monetary Fund. It's to provide loans. They only provide a fraction of money as grant. So how can we see them? So basically what they want to make sure that these funding streams that are there are counted as funding arrangements, and eventually they'll only provide loans to vulnerable communities and countries. Again, it circles back to the same point that I was making earlier. It is unjust to expect developing countries to take money for recovery. And for us, the eye-opening example was Mozambique being hit by twin cyclones in 2019 and is forced to take loans from IMF. So one, they're being made vulnerable because of the larger macroeconomic policies promoted by IMF and World Bank, which has made these countries vulnerable. And now when they are being hit by climate impacts, they are being forced to take money as loan from the same system that has made them vulnerable. And that was the point when we said we have to bring the issues of debt and climate together. And what we see that if EU gets its way, then it's going to promote MDBs and IMF as part of funding arrangement, which means they will not provide public finance, rather this money for rehabilitation and reconstruction as loan. And they also want to integrate vulnerability into allocation decisions. Yes, we are about supporting countries who have less capacity, such as least developed countries or even island states, but not at the cost of ignoring other countries. And I must tell you the other challenge. We have been the strongest proponent and supporters for LDCs. In my own region, Bhutan, which was a chair of LDC, is not going to be LDC November onwards, December onwards. This year, they're just stepping out of that list because of the so-called criteria. Are they going to be less vulnerable December 2023 onwards? Bangladesh is going to be out of this list next year in 2024, which means if they are hit by a disaster in 2025, unfortunately, and they're very poor, they're not going to get any support. The following year, we will see in 2026, Nepal is going to be out. So in the next 20 years, probably 20 countries are going to be out of that list, which means they will not get any support. Now, this is where we don't want it to limit to certain categories of countries. We want to keep it open, and for us, it's vulnerable communities. That should be at the center, and that's how we should determine. So look at what EU is saying, vulnerability allocation decisions, and their own definition of vulnerability. US is only talking about strengthening pre-arranged finance, which is a tiny part of money that is made available. And again, talking about the humanitarian sector, which has never provided sufficient amount of money. Recovery and reconstruction, again, they are going to push for MDBs. And they are talking about human mobility, which is good. Displacement is something that we are concerned about, and we need to be addressing that. Now, look at what Pakistan is saying, and especially suffering from a massive disaster last year. They're saying the existing funding arrangements must be of different sources and fund processes and initiatives that deliver the much needed impact on ground much more quickly and to complement the fund. Quite similar to what G77 and China is saying, and China in its individual submission, particularly talking about the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and distributing the responsibility equitably, which means based on historical responsibility. So this is where you can see the positions of various countries. Let me quickly share the criteria, and then we can also open the floor and have a more interaction. Now, from civil society perspective, that's the criteria that we have put. Any funding stream that is being put forth and being counted as loss and damage funding arrangement should be assessed whether it recognizes and aims to comprehensively address loss and damage, or just doing tiny bit here and there. The funding must be obligatory and compensatory, and not what you can do, but what is needed. We need to be compensating. It is about the lost development, and money has to be provided as grants and non-debt instruments. Third, money needs to be new, additional, predictable, and adequate. It's not just about what you can provide, it's about what is needed and how it can be predictable so that countries can plan rehabilitation and reconstruction accordingly. It has to be equitably governed, which means vulnerable countries and developing countries should have more say in terms of its governance and access. And it should provide direct access to all developing countries and communities. Fifth, ensuring the meaningful and effective participation of affected communities. Communities should have a say in how funding is being provided. And sixth, acknowledge, respect, and promote intersectional human rights. Again, we need to make sure that money that's provided is respecting human rights and not it cannot be so-called donor driven, and we don't even call donors, we say contributors, and not their policies. And that's exactly what they want to do if money is channeled through multilateral development banks. So what we need to do is to make sure whatever is counted, and we will be coming up with a report which we'll share with you on how, based on this criteria, certain institutions must be assessed. And we are going to give an example of a couple of institutions to actually make sure that we don't want, as I said earlier, double counting or triple counting of the money that is being provided, and it has to be beyond the ODA, official development assistance, and it has to be new and additional. So we are going to be doing that assessment, but the important part is we cannot allow rich countries to count anything and everything underfunding arrangements to give a false impression and hope that things are happening, money is being provided, whereas on ground we see that needs of the vulnerable communities are not being met. So that's where we are, and developing countries want fund to be the anchor and coordinate with the funding arrangements, and developed countries want exactly the opposite. They want fund to be a tiny part of the overall funding arrangements. And I can tell you this whole issue is of control. They don't want a fund which can run independently and based on a particular criteria. They want this funding arrangement to take a much bigger space so that they can continue to dictate how money is spent. And that's exactly the fight that we are having right now in these negotiations. So we need to make sure that it's fund that is supreme, and that's going to make sure that support that is needed at a level at which we see impacts is provided to vulnerable communities and countries. So that's where we are. And I'm happy to respond to questions. And Sumaya, if I've left something, please feel free to add.
Thank you, Harshit. I mean, it's quite a refreshing presentation, outlining what the key issues are. So I will open the floor now for any questions, comments, inputs to what we just heard. I do have one. I haven't seen a hand, but I'm happy to first wait a bit and see if we are getting any comments.
Either people didn't get me at all and I wasn't clear, or I was super clear. So either way,
I guess it's more the latter, because in the chat box the feedback is quite positive, and I guess there is no lack of clarity with regards to what the position of developing countries is. All right, and it's for that reason. It's quite intuitive, as to what will be fair, what will be the demand of developing countries, including African countries. Sometimes the question becomes, how do you turn things around? I mean, we've had this discussion earlier around the time it takes for things to move, how legal and political positions adjust over time. Maybe something that you can share is obviously it's a change of heart and a change of responsibility and accountability from the global north that is at the core of success here. How can we collectively collaborate in putting pressure and advancing thinking on loss and damage? In this instance, I mean civil society, developing countries, etc., such that we can achieve a meaningful outcome of this process? That will be the first question. And then I've got one last question that will be applicable to both. It's your reflections.
Sorry, can you just repeat the question part of it, Coalitin?
It's how do we put the pressure to change the accountability of the global north towards what is obviously convergence on position by developing countries?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question, because if you had not asked this question, I would have anyway taken the floor and made an appeal. And now I'm going to turn this into an appeal. First of all, I must share that I'm so happy to see Sumaya here, and I also see Alpha is going to join and talk about climate finance. Africa has played an important role, and Africa must continue to play a leadership role. And I will also say Africa must do more. To call rich countries out on what's happening, how grave injustice is being done to Africa in so many ways, and it's not limited to just loss and damage. And I'm sure you know, and from the IPCC reports, that Africa is going to suffer a lot more than many other regions in the world. And already the global average temperature is rising faster in Africa than other parts. So I'm not going to get into scientific data. You can Google that. What we need to do, and I'm so happy that I'm speaking to campaigners and climate justice advocates, please call rich countries out and by picking up those real instances that we are putting out on social media and telling the way they're arm twisting, the way they're putting pressure. So people like Sumaya and Alpha and other negotiators are fighting a very bitter fight, but a very important one. You know, from outside, it's very hard to understand what is going on in these meetings. It's a very dirty game. You know, the way they push us, the way they first portray their image in public is very different from how they speak when they are off camera. The true color comes out. They don't care what's happening to Africa. They don't care what's happening to poor people. They don't care if people are dying. They only care about themselves. Rich countries only care about their economy. You know, and some of them said it, some of them don't say it, but they do exactly that. If they had cared about climate impacts, if they had cared about our lives and our struggle and our realities, they would have provided climate finance. They would have not blocked the definition of climate finance. They would have provided real finance. And I don't have to explain, just look around how much money and how fast the money is being made available for wars, and how we are struggling to get even millions for climate finance. Here, hundreds of billions and trillions are being provided for wars because they care about their safety, they care about their industry, they don't care about us. So we have to call them out. We have to expose their hypocrisy. So use social media, use your voice, write about it, do campaigning, tell the world how they are double-faced, how they have delayed climate action for 30 years. We knew about it 50 years ago. More than 30 years ago, we had this convention, and look at where we are. Nobody cared about whether 600 million people in Africa have energy or not. Nobody in the world cared about. Now, when there was a war, from Russian invasion in Ukraine, and they felt they are going to face this energy insecurity, they're all rushing to Africa. Not that they care about Africa, they want to take away resources of Africa. They want to dig and drill everywhere just to be secure, in their own countries to get access to energy. Please call their hypocrisy out. Ask them questions. Where were you in the last 30 years? Why didn't you care about our energy access? Why you only talk about Africa when you don't have, energy security, and you fear about that, and you want to extract, our resources? Those are the questions that we need to be asking, and tell them how they are responsible for this loss and damage. So we are asked, first we were asking them money for climate action. Now we are asking them, because of their climate inaction, we are facing loss and damage. Loss and damage is a result of insufficient mitigation and inadequate adaptation support. If we have sufficient adaptation support, we'll be able to minimize loss and damage. Understand this continuum if mitigation doesn't happen. So when we fight to get resources to address loss and damage, it's not that we are not fighting for mitigation. We have to stay below 1.5. We have to make sure that more resources are available for adaptation. Because those two things did not happen, we are facing loss and damage. So we now also need resources to address loss and damage, to help people rebuild their homes and lives and recover their farms from the kind of damage they have seen. That's the reality. So please call out the hypocrisy of rich countries and tell them you are responsible for this crisis. Sorry for this rant, but I'm really very angry.
No, it's most useful, Harjit. I think we all need to hear that, because at some point we lose the bigger picture as to what exactly is happening and why, and what are we trying to achieve in the long term. I see we've got two hands. The first one is Tamsir, and then followed by Emmanuel. I'll take both hands, starting with you, Tamsir.
Thank you very much. This presentation is really wonderful. So I really enjoy it. So, yeah, so actually, the issue of loss and damage is actually so comprehensive, and like also it's a very broad thing. So like, okay, I just have a quick question regarding like, the funding modalities and monitoring and evaluation processes, because I feel like as long as there is loss and damage fund, I guess like there are supposed to be funding modalities and like, the priorities, and also the monitoring and evaluation processes of this funding, that especially like, in the global south and developing, like Africa to be specific, because sorry, as long as like, uh, we cannot, Africa cannot just be seen as like, we like the developed countries cannot see Africa as they are compensating Africa.
Recorded.
For the price of climate finance, like especially in loss and damage issues and whatever. So because when the developed countries see us like, climate finance like compensating Africa, or like, sympathizing Africa, it's not the deal. The issue is like, there are like two parties involved. Like, okay, there's already loss and damage that is done, and then like the greater chunk of like, loss and damage or climate change issues have been greatly impacted by the global north. So it is high time that they paid for the price of climate change. That is where the climate finance modalities came in. So, but then like the question here will be like in terms of like the funding modalities and the monitoring and evaluation, and even that like the climate finance is being operationalized. Now, most of the funding, like, will be focused in the developing countries and Africa to be specific. So it is like a well-known fact that, it is always difficult, especially things related to funding or finance, like people mismanage the funding. So if we don't have proper monitoring and evaluation mechanism, it is like, we just probably trying to spend on something that is not really sustainable. But if we have proper monitoring and evaluation to see that, like there is an instituted body that is responsible to make sure like the fund that has been allocated is judiciously and rightly used to its intended purpose. Because like okay, when we have funding, we've seen like most of these issues happening like during the COVID-19, like the COVID relief package. It's been politicized. Most of these funding that were given to some government agencies were being politicized. So if you're not supporting my agenda as a politician, you are rightfully not, or you are liable not to get the fund. But like the climate fund or the climate finance fund supposed not to be seen as political objection, because but rather like it's supposed to be given to the people that rightfully deserve it. But then it is definitely very difficult that to be honest, we have to be very honest. Like in Africa, it's a problem because like the corruption happening is a big threat to climate finance. So if only we have strong institutions that are responsible to make sure like there is the proper monitoring and evaluation process towards the climate change or climate finance, then we can probably see how best we can fight towards the adverse effect of climate change. But if not, it is the same thing. We will just be given the fund at the moment, but we cannot sustain the fund. So it's like very important that we talk about the monitoring and evaluation processes. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tamsil. Emmanuel?
Thank you very much once again, and Ajit, thank you very much for that entry. I really didn't think I'll raise the hand again, but what he said towards the end is really what inspired me to at least make an opinion out of that. It's really true. We must fight the hypocrisy head on. We started with mitigation when we knew scientifically we had the proof that climate change is going to affect us. And the truth of the fact is that Africa really doesn't contribute to the greenhouse effect. Africa only contributes to 4%. And yet even this mitigation agenda that we push, they've been telling us to plant more trees, but we have enough trees in Africa. They've been talking about against using charcoal, for example. But if you come to my country, Malawi, for example, even if we use charcoal for the next 70 years, we will not deplete our forests. So it's clear these guys are making an excuse out of their own carelessness. They want us to shield their mistakes. So when they fail to mitigate, they now brought in adaptation. And the way they convince our leaders, talk about adaptation finance and stuff, these are things that they never achieve. They just use these things to hoodwink us. And now they failed with adaptation. Now here we are, loss and damage. All these are fruits of their carelessness. So we must really demand with a voice that they must know that we know who is responsible. And we know it's them who are supposed to shield this. The only problem that I would say is, Hajit said, our leaders must really speak with a strong voice, and we must speak as one. The only problem is that the hypocrisy is not only coming in from the Western developed countries. Even our own African leaders have failed us. The hypocrisy is also right here in Africa. It's at home. I'm talking from experience. The past three years, I worked as a special assistant to the Minister of Climate Change and Natural Resources in Malawi. So I've been to these meetings. I know what happens during the meetings and what happens behind the scenes. You find that most of our leaders put their personal interests before our country's interests. So you find that before meetings, even before CoP, when the ministers meet, out of envelopes, exchange hands, these countries give money to our leaders suddenly. And when they go there, they don't really fight for Africa. They are already bribed, and they are happy with the money they get. So hypocrisy starts from within. So we as young private activists, we must really voice out, even right here at home. We must make sure our leaders know that we are holding them accountable. When our leaders are going for CoP, they must know that there are millions of voices out there that are waiting for good outcome from them. So that if we do that, we will be able to hold our leaders accountable. And then these leaders can also hold these developed countries accountable. Otherwise, if we just target the developed countries, we are forgetting that we have our leaders as middlemen. And these are the people that strike all the deals on our behalf. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you so much. That was very eye-opening, and we really need to speak and speak now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel. I guess we are at the stage where we need to start wrapping up. And from my side, the point that I just want to...
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I will give you an opportunity to do your closing remarks and respond to some of the questions that have been raised. And from my side, I just wanted, something caught my attention when you spoke about a needs-based provision of finance. If, in my view, as much as that can link primarily to the GST outcomes rather than the specific discussions on loss and damage, this is one message that needs to be strong. And if it can be achieved at COP28, it unlocks quite a number of other negotiations, such as on the new collective quantified goal, et cetera, because we are, it's important for us as developing countries to move away from or to increase accountability. A needs-based approach to climate action is imperative. And addressing needs of countries in their transitions to low carbon, climate resilient economies is an equity question. All right. And if we can get that through, that messaging through from all fronts, this is something that can be groundbreaking and enabling. And I've attached a link. There's a group that I work with in the equity working group of the Independent Global Stocktake. I've attached one paper that we have written that focuses specifically on that point. There are other resources on loss and damage and equity, etc. And I just encourage everybody to have a look at those. Now, having said that, Harjit, I will give you an opportunity to round up your discussion, and I will do the same for you, Sumaya, afterwards. And we can now start the closing processes of this webinar. Harjit, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you for saying. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. GST and the new collective quantified goal are clear opportunities where we can link and talk about the scale. And the scale is in hundreds of billions of dollars, which is unfortunate. And again, it connects with the inaction related to mitigation and adaptation in particular. Now, so Emmanuel, thank you very much for asking that. And then you also, in fact, responded to a couple of things that I wanted to say to Tamsir's question. There is no doubt that we have to put our house in order as developing countries. There are issues in terms of leakages and corruption. But at the same time, I don't want rich countries to lecture us, because rich countries have, one, institutionalized corruption in their countries, and particularly the US, the way they are lobbied, the way fossil fuel companies, pharmaceutical companies, you name it, they have legalized lobbying, and policymakers are receiving money as a legal thing to push their issues. That's corruption. But because they have legalized it, they can't call it corruption. And I do acknowledge that in rich countries or countries that are in transition, they have fixed the basic level of delivery, so the ordinary citizen doesn't find corruption on a day-to-day basis. But look at the increased inequality within those countries. US again is an example. US comes as one of the top 5 countries with the highest inequality in a country. Is that not corruption? It's a corruption of a different order. So on one hand, I know there is corruption, and I'm not trying to find excuses to say, no, it's not there, or justify corruption. But I don't want rich countries to use that as a reason to say, we're not going to provide you climate finance because you are yet to fix the system. And they are also the ones who are further corrupting our system by offering money to our policymakers in exchange of land or natural resources and many other perks that they are offering. So they are equally responsible for increasing corruption in our countries. So they have no moral right to talk about it. Having said that, what you said, Emmanuel, is absolutely right. We need to make sure that we have systems in place. We need to make sure that we hold our politicians to account, to make sure that money that comes from the international system and from our own domestic resources goes to the people who deserve and on whose name this money is being raised, be it the taxpayer money in their own country or from outside. So no doubt about it. But we need to understand it's a much bigger game. And in fact, on one event, I said that when this question came, when it comes to trade, they don't talk about corruption. When they have to take away our natural resources, they don't talk about corruption. When they have to provide climate finance, they talk about corruption. If you think we are corrupt, don't do trade with us. If you think we are corrupt, don't take our natural resources. You can't just keep saying it when they have to fulfill their responsibility on climate finance. So I just want us to understand these are two different fights. They are connected, but they are distinct. We have to make sure that we as civil society continue to strengthen our own systems, continue to demand accountability of our own leaders, continue to make sure that we mobilize communities so that they have a much larger and stronger voice to hold our leaders to account from local, subnational, national, and international levels. But that cannot become an excuse. I also see there's a question from Joshua, so I want to respond.
Okay, go ahead.
Is there hope for loss and damage to be offered as grants? That's exactly the fight, and hope depends on us, how much pressure we put. And that's why that criteria, we need to be technically sound, we need to be politically smart, and we need to be communicating our demands in a very smart manner through media. All that is needed, and that's exactly what we are trying to do by putting forth that criteria, by engaging, and Sumaya, Alpha, and others are playing such an important role, at their own level, pushing them hard, sharing what is needed. So that fight is happening at multiple levels. I'm sure Sumaya can talk about it. On resource mobilization, again, at this very meeting where we have just come from, that was the conversation, and that's where Sumaya and others were pushing it so hard. Let's talk about the resource mobilization. You can't just say may. The language that they're using for resource mobilization is may. They're not talking about funding cycles, pledging, cycles and conferences to make sure it happens. They don't want to see any system. That's exactly the fight. So again, we have to up our game. We have to be very, very smart in doing that. And we have to talk about all these issues in public and expose them and hit them really hard. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Harjit. Any last words from your side, Sumaya, before we wrap up?
Yeah, thank you, Kolisa. I would also like to thank Harjit for the hard work they have been doing and the support they provided to the TC. I guess for the youth, I mean, they need really to re-engage and to start play the role Harjit was talking about, because in relation to loss and damages, I guess the preparation should start from now. I mean, I guess this is a preparatory stage for you if you are planning to attend the CoP or even to follow from a distance, because these issues will affect, and it is affecting and will affect the future generation. The issues Harjit was talking about, vulnerability, the debt, and the um, the way the developed countries are trying to take the leadership. I guess this shouldn't really be the case, because at TC4, one of colleagues from developed country, when she came, she said, we want to have a word. What do you really want out of this meeting? I said, we want everything that we asked for, because this is our fund. We need to design it the way we see it. So I guess you need to start raising the high ceiling everywhere. If you are from the side of the NGOs, I guess the decision that were taken at the level of the COPs on loss and damage were taken with difficulty, but with support of the civil society and the protest and campaigning around the negotiator. these things would really matter a lot. However, I guess some of you also talked about the that they want to see themselves engaged in the discussion. I guess through your delegation and through your institution that you are working in, also uh, do your best to engage and find the fight for the interest of your country. Um, I didn't really want to sound like lecturing, but anyway, I guess we had a very good discussion, and I'm quite happy that I was part of this discussion. So once again and more, colleagues, thank you for so much, and thank you for the collegium for engaging us. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thank you, Sumaya. I've been requested that we switch our cameras on. They want to take the organizers to take a screenshot of the participants. So I'll try to sit up straight as well and look presentable. So everybody is invited to do so. Not just us, panelists and the moderator, everybody present.
Just take a long.
Is it working? I'm not that competent when it comes to this.
Hi, Joshua. Can you please give us an update if we're all good and everything is working out? Thanks.
The smiles are going to fade. Okay, so we can do it again, but from my side, the last slide. Let me just make sure that I've got the correct. It's more of feedback on the seminar itself. Let me try to get that right. Okay. No, which one? What is showing the description? Okay. Once again, you can go to your Mentimeter just to give us some feedback on today's webinar. This is part of a series of.
Let's try one more time.
Let's see. Can you see? Mentimeter. Okay. Yep, there we go. Please make your inputs on the device you are using for the interactive portion of the presentation. This is feedback on the logistics and structure of the webinar, if you think they were good or great. Useful nature of the information shared, the opportunity to share your views, and readiness for participating at COP28. So please go ahead. Okay, as people fill in the feedback form, that's all from my side. This is the first of three, so tomorrow we will be talking climate finance, and then on Wednesday it will be adaptation. So I look forward to engaging with you again. Over to you, Joshua and Tato.
Okay, I think Joshua's having some technical issues, but thank you very much for today's session, to the panelists and to the participants. Hope to see you tomorrow and on Wednesday. Please ensure that you use the link that we have shared to register for the upcoming webinars, and also so that we can have your email addresses and be able to share the resources that we have. Thank you and have a lovely afternoon, evening, and that is all from us. Bye.
Goodbye.